Hi, I'm Beth Dean, the CEO of Cure Epilepsy. Thank you for joining us as part of Purple Day Around the World, the 2021 conference. Cure Epilepsy's mission is to promote and fund patient-focused research to find a cure for epilepsy. Since our founding over 20 years ago, we have raised over $78 million and funded over 260 grants supporting novel research projects to accelerate the search for cures and more effective treatments. Today, you'll have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Scott Perry about how a medication for epilepsy, or any other disease, becomes available. This is called the drug development process, and it starts with basic research which is done with scientists in the laboratory and ends with clinical trials which help determine whether a promising treatment is effective and has the potential to be approved by the FDA. You'll also hear from Hillary Savoie, who will provide the patient perspective on the importance of educating and engaging the patient community when setting up clinical trials. I am pleased to introduce you to Dr. Scott Perry. Dr. Perry is the Medical Director of Neurology at Cook Children's in Fort Worth, Texas. Dr. Perry focuses on the treatment of childhood onset epilepsy, especially in children with uncontrolled epilepsy or for whom the cause has not been determined. Additionally, he created the Genetic Epilepsy Clinic to improve the diagnosis, understanding, and treatment of children with rare genetic epilepsies. Welcome, Dr. Perry.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you to the organizing committee for Purple Day for inviting me here to talk to you all about the clinical trials process and how clinical research is carried out. I know a lot of you have a lot of questions about it that come up in your day-to-day activities and your visits with your doctor, so I hope we cover a lot of those questions for you today. Just quickly, some disclosures. To begin with, I am an investigator in a number of different clinical research trials, and these are some of the companies which I've worked with recently. So to begin, we want to ask the question, what is a clinical trial? And a clinical trial, very simply, is a study designed to answer a very specific question. And I underline in bold specific because that's going to answer some of your questions down the road of, why does my child not qualify for this study or that study? And it's because the question is always quite specific. What we're doing in a clinical trial is we're trying to determine if a new treatment for a disease works. Or maybe we're taking a medication that's already approved and we're trying to find out if it could be approved for another condition, maybe a different seizure type or a different epilepsy syndrome. Maybe we're looking at a combination of medications or a new device. Maybe they're looking at a way to prevent a disease from occurring, or even a test that might help diagnose a disease. So the next question a lot of people have is, who should participate in a clinical trial, in a research study? And the answer is anyone should consider that. And it really depends on what is being studied and what your goal as the patient or a caregiver for a patient is. What are you trying to achieve? Have you tried what seemingly is every treatment out there and you're looking for the new thing? Then that's a reason. Is it that you want to contribute data maybe that helps not you personally, but helps science to figure out the treatment long-term for other people with a condition? Or maybe you're trying to help learn a new way to diagnose it? That's a different reason. So there's a variety of different reasons why you might want to participate in a trial. And when you're thinking about it, the things you could consider are, first of all, what type of trial is it? Is it a trial where you are trying a medicine? And if it is it a trial where you know you're going to get the medicine? Or is it a placebo-controlled trial where you might not get the medicine? And in that case, you're going to think about what situation are you in at the time? And, are you ready to be in a study where you might get placebo or an inactive treatment for a certain number of months? What exactly is being studied? For the purposes of epilepsy, are we studying to try to see if the medicine works for epilepsy, or is this study designed just to see if the treatment is safe? Is this just to determine if the right dose is being used? There are a lot of different questions that might come up that will then play into what your role in the study is. What's already known about the treatment? Is this never been used in humans? Is this the first time it's ever been tried? And if so, what is our basis for thinking it's safe to even try it in humans? Why do we think it might work? Or is it something that's been out there? It's a medicine that's already been studied in adults. We know it works. We're just trying to find out, does it work in kids, for example? That's a whole different question. What is your commitment? Your commitment as the individual participating in the study. What is expected of you? How long does the study last? What kind of test are you going to have to go through? Is it just taking a medicine and getting some lab tests, or are there going to be other invasive procedures? Is there a surgery involved? There are a lot of different questions there. And of course, always, and this is a decision that, it's a very close conversation of you with the investigator, is what are the risks of this study? What are the known risks? Understanding we don't know them all. That's why it's research. We're trying to find out what are the risks of this treatment, for instance, and then what are the benefits? And again, that's where past data, what we know about the investigation already, plays into the role of you making that decision. I want to quickly just kind of go over with you the different phases of drug development trials, just so when you're looking at trials and you're trying to decide, is this right for me, you understand where this trial is in the hierarchy of drug study. So one thing you may hear about out there is preclinical. When you see data on preclinical studies, that's generally something that's happening in a lab. That is a study that we're doing with mice or zebrafish, or maybe they're just doing it with cells and trying to get a signal to see, for instance, if a drug might work. The next phase that's only recently kind of been talked about, something we call a phase 0. And a phase 0 is not something you're going to see a lot of, but phase 0 is a trial where they're trying to get a quick kind of feel for if something works. So for like in cancer studies, they may use the drug in a very small population with a type of cancer, just to see, does the drug get to the brain like we think it's supposed to. And if it does, that gives a signal that at least makes sense to study for more people later on. Then a phase 1 is where you take a medicine that you think may be effective, and the first thing you do is you study it in healthy people. And what you're trying to determine is, in a very healthy person, how does the drug work, as far as what dose gives you what level and in the blood, and what is the safety, what side effects happen when a person takes a small dose, what happens when they take a really big dose. And then the next phase is phase 2, and that generally, it's completed phase 1. We know that healthy people can take it and nothing really bad happens. It seems to be well tolerated. It gets into the organ system we want it to. So if it's a drug that we want to work on the brain, we know it gets to the brain. So now we're going to take people that have the condition. We'll take people that, for instance, have whatever epilepsy we want to study, a small group, and we're going to give them that medication. And we may be giving it in different doses and trying to understand, in a person with the actual condition we're concerned about, how do they tolerate the medicine? Does it get to the brain like it's supposed to? Does it cause any serious side effects? Does it interact with any medicines they commonly would take? Things like that. Now, the phase 3 study is the one that most people are going to be involved in most often, most familiar with. And that's really where we're trying to find out, does a drug work, and will it serve the purpose we want it to serve? So these are generally going to be studies where we take it, we are studying a whole group with a very specific condition. Some people are going to get the drug, some people might get placebo, for example, and then we are going to see how they tolerate it, and then in the end see, was it effective at doing what we thought it was, answering the question we had, that very specific question, and how safe it was. And then finally, the fourth stage is one of post-marketing efficacy. So this is after the drug's been approved. It's already out there in the world. People are using it. Now we're collecting more almost real life. It's no longer restricted by that protocol that we have in phase 3. Now it's just kind of what happens in real life. And this is where you find sometimes some side effects you didn't know about in the original study, because maybe a certain drug that it interacts with was not allowed in the phase 3 study. But in real life, people take that drug. And so you may find out that there's a problem that you originally maybe didn't know about or weren't aware of. So the next part I want to go with is kind of what it would look like if you wanted to participate in a trial. And the first thing that's going to happen when you think about participating in a trial, and you sign up and you go, is that you're going to get what's called informed consent. And informed consent is the most important step we take in research. And that is because this is where we have a discussion with you, the participant, and make sure that you understand what the research is, what we're trying to answer, what you are going to be, and how you're going to be involved, what you're going to have to do, and what those risks might be to you. And this is it's important. I list on the side kind of all the elements of an informed consent. Anybody that's been through it knows that it's, 15 pages long worth of stuff that we're going over, because we want to make sure you understand every piece as best we can of what you're being involved in, and make sure you have an opportunity to ask questions, because it's not informed unless you're asking questions and we're giving you the answers and we feel like both sides understand exactly what we're signing on to do. There's also something called assent. So informed consent is generally people over the age of 18 who are able to make their own kind of legal decisions, whereas assent is a person who's too young to give informed consent, but they're certainly old enough and cognitively well enough to understand what they're getting involved in. And so, kids understand what kind of research they're being involved in and what's going to be asked of them. And so they deserve an opportunity, if they're of that developmental level, to say, yes, I want to participate. I want to be part of this and have this research done. So what is the process? So have you done informed consent? You want to do it. You're moving full speed ahead. Well, the first thing you have to know is that we are running the trial, whatever trial we're doing, we're running it by a very strict protocol. We're talking about hundreds of pages worth of instructions on how this is going to be carried out. And everybody that's involved in the research trial has been trained on that protocol, and we need to make sure that we follow the steps exactly. And so that's why when you come to the appointments, it's often very regimented. There's a certain number of tests that are going to get done every time. We tell you that you have to come to the appointments within a certain window of time. And that's because in order to get results that we can interpret fairly confidently, we need to make sure everyone in the trial experienced the same thing. So if some people are on the medicine and they didn't come back for 3 months and other people came at 1 month, there may be completely different outcomes of how those two people did. And that's why everyone has to follow the exact same process. All the data is monitored very closely. So everything we put into a database, and then you get people coming back to you that are looking over that data and are making sure that that data is correct, that it's complete. Any changes that happen, we're going to put it down. And that's why, sometimes people are like, why do you need to know I took a vitamin? Like that, what's that have to do with anything? It could have nothing to do with the study for sure. But what if we find out later that vitamin somehow interacts with the medication and that changed your outcome? That's why we need to know every single change that happens along the way. We might not need that data in the end, but the last thing you want to do is get to the end of the study and find out you wish you had some data that you forgot to get along the way, which is why we ask so much. As a patient, know that you have a study ID assigned to you that is linked to your identification at the site that's doing your study, but it's not linked to you as far as many of the trials go. So people who are looking at your information know your study, know you are a study number, but don't know you as a person and necessarily be able to identify you and your history. And then we hold on to that data for a specified time frame. Usually it's several years after the study is completed, and then once all the data has been used as it's needed, there's rules around how it's destroyed, and we get rid of anything. So here are kind of the most common steps you'll see in a phase 3 trial. The first part is usually a screening or baseline phase. This is a phase where you've come in, we've said, yes, you seem to meet the baseline criteria for the study. You got the right condition. You don't have any major health problems that interfere. You're not on any medicines that you shouldn't be on for the study. And for epilepsy trials, this is usually the time where we change nothing. You just do what you do every day. Your medicines don't change, and you count seizures every day. And the reason for that is because we need to know, how do you look before we do any treatment? That way we know what we're comparing to. We don't usually bring people directly into a study and just start doing it. And the reason for that is because a lot of people that enter research trials might be entering research trials because they're at a period in their epilepsy where things are really bad. They're having a lot of seizures. And any of you who've lived with epilepsy for many years know that there's an up and down to the history of epilepsy. And there's some really bad times and there's some decent times for seizure control. And so if we take everybody as soon as they come in and they're doing very poorly, the fact that 3 months later they're doing much better might not be because the drug did anything. It might just be the natural up and down of their epilepsy. So we like to have a period of time where we just watch and see what's going on. The next phase is the treatment phase. Now, this is where you're going to receive the investigative treatment. And depending on how the study's designed, you may get the actual drug that we're trying to study, or you might get a placebo or a drug or a substance that doesn't do anything, but it looks exactly the same as the treatment, and we try to compare the two. And then once that's over, that part usually lasts a few months in duration. And then after that, many studies have what's called an open label phase. And this is the part of the study where everybody gets to be put on the treatment now. So the people who were on the treatment continue on the treatment. The people who are on the placebo also get an opportunity to be on treatment. And then you continue that generally for a few years. It usually depends on if the drug was worked, then it depends on when the FDA has approved it. And once the FDA approves it, then that part of the trial will end and you start to get on the drug that you get from the pharmacy. Adverse events, patient safety is number one in trials. And so you're going to have people asking you about every single thing that happens to you throughout the trial. And we want to know about everything. If you had a fever, we want to know about it. If you had a cough, we want to know about it. We know those things are common, but we're looking at a group that's on treatment, a group that's not on treatment. So we'll be able to compare and understand, is fever something the drug caused, or was fever maybe something that was just part of irregular health? And then there's always a safety monitoring board who's also looking at this. That's kind of an independent group who looks at the data to make sure that there are no safety concerns that are coming up that mean we should somehow change the trial. And that's important because you've got, patients want to be in the trial often and they want, something that works. Doctors want it to work. And it's always good to have a third party that's not directly involved in the research, looking over everything and making sure it's safe and there's no conflict of interest, nobody, trying to make it go ahead just to get the drug approved. So the next question as a patient or caregiver is, how can I find research to participate in? And the first thing you should do is always talk to your doctor, because your doctor may be aware of studies that they're doing maybe at their site, or they're aware at studies that are going on other sites specific to your condition. If they're not aware of anything, you can always go to clinicaltrials.gov. This is a website where you basically put in your condition, maybe you put in your seizure type, and it will pull up for you all of the trials that are recently completed, that are currently enrolling patients, and ones that are planning to enroll patients in the very near future. And with those links, you can see what are the requirements, the basic requirements, what kind of patients are they looking for, what age, what condition. You can get a basic idea of what kind of trial it is. And then at the bottom of the page, it lets you know the sites that are planning to participate. And then, of course, always, if your epilepsy syndrome has an advocacy group, stay up to date with them. Advocacy groups are always on top of what's going on. They often know about drug trials, for instance, other treatment trials that are happening that aren't even on clinicaltrials.gov yet, but are planned for the future. So keep up with them for sure. Now, in this last piece, I'm just going to go over some common questions that I get asked when I talk about research, and hopefully this will ask a lot of questions, or answer a lot of questions for you guys. So the first is, why are trials so strict on who is included? And the reason for that is basically we have to eliminate as many variables that could affect outcome as we can. So, for instance, there's a lot of studies recently on Dravet syndrome. And one of the reasons for that is Dravet syndrome is a very specific thing. It is a very specific syndrome, often with a very specific reason for it. And that's different than if we just chose, let's study, for instance, generalized tonic-clonic, or what people call grand mal seizures. There's lots of reasons for grand mal seizures. So if we just studied that one seizure type, we'd have all these different reasons. And so you might not really see that it works because you've got people with lots of different conditions and it doesn't work in one condition like it does in another. And then what happens is they cancel each other out. And the next question, why are placebo groups used? Actually, the next two questions, why are placebo groups used? Why are they blinded? And a third question, why are they randomized? All of these are reasons. The reasons we do this is to avoid bias. As a patient, if you know that you are getting a treatment that might work for seizures, you have a higher likelihood of feeling like it works. And maybe your overall counts of seizures will improve and you will feel better because you know you're getting treatment. Likewise, as a doctor, if I know I'm giving you a treatment, I might be biased to feel like it worked a little better than it did. So that's why we have to have one group that's on a drug and one group that's not. And neither of them know. That's where the blinding comes in. The patients don't know what they're on, and often the doctors also don't know who's on what treatment. That way we eliminate that bias altogether. And then we randomize it again, to eliminate bias. If everybody knew the first half of the study was getting treatment and the next half of the people was not getting treatment, then everyone knows what they're on. And so instead it's randomized, and we have systems that just will choose for us whether you get the treatment or you don't. The next question has come up a lot in epilepsy studies recently, and that's, why don't you tell me all the criteria for the study? And that criteria we usually don't tell you is the number of seizures required in the baseline phase. And the reason for that is, again, kind of, I guess, a little bit obvious. We don't want people to tell us they're having the number of seizures they have that meets the criteria when that's not actually what happens, right? I mean, if the criteria is you need 6 seizures in a month and you only had 3, but you really want to be in the study, so you tell us you had 6, and then in the study you still had 3 seizures because that's what you always have, then it looks like you had a 50% improvement in your seizures when that's really not what happened. And so some criteria we do keep to ourselves in order not to bias the population. Why are rare diseases so popular? Well, the reason for that are a few things. Number one, there are pathways through the FDA to get orphan drug status. An orphan drug status is a treatment for a rare condition, and this actually it's a faster pathway oftentimes, so you'll want to pick that. The other reason you choose rare diseases is because, like I said, for Dravet syndrome, they're very specific conditions, so you know the population is very similar to each other and sometimes easier to identify. The next question is coming up a lot in the epilepsy world, which is why are natural history studies needed? The reason for that is a lot of the treatments in epilepsy, fortunately, are moving towards not just treating seizures, but trying to treat the whole condition. So again, I'll use Dravet syndrome as an example. Some of the new kind of genetic-based treatments we're using are trying to treat seizures, but also the learning problems, the behavior, the sleep, the trouble walking. And what we don't know about Dravet syndrome is, what does Dravet syndrome look like? How do all those things related? We know how many seizures, how frequent the seizures are, but how does the frequency of seizures relate to how their learning is, or how does their learning relate to how their sleep is? And so we have to have a natural history where we just kind of watch what happens in Dravet syndrome, so that when we study a disease-modifying therapy like a genetic therapy, we have more than just seizure frequency to compare for outcome, because we need to show that it actually changes the course of disease. What does a trial cost me? Oftentimes, not much of anything. Sometimes there's some cost with travel if you have to come to more visits, but a lot of trials actually cover those costs for people. The actual treatment, at least in phase 3 drug trials, the treatment, the lab test, those things, anything that's part of the protocol for the study is covered by the study. What you'll want to know is what is not covered. So for instance, if in the study you had an adverse effect that resulted in some harm, maybe you were hospitalized or you had some side effect that was severe of that nature, you'll want to know, is that going to be covered by the study, or is that not going to be covered? Those are questions you'll have to ask, because they can be different for each study. And then the last one, as I said, why do we ask so many questions? We ask so many questions because if we don't, and we get to the end of the study and we didn't ask, and we don't have the data, we run the risk of missing something that was really important that could answer a question. So we try to cover everything we absolutely can. So I covered a lot there. I covered it pretty quickly. I'm going to take a few minutes here just to answer any additional questions that might have come in. Thanks so much.
Here are some questions that we received for Dr. Perry. How do they develop clinical trials for the rare epilepsies where the patients may be more difficult to locate?
Yeah. Well, yeah, those are not easy to do, that's for sure. I mean, Dravet syndrome is by no means super common, right? But the first thing they have in their ballpark is a great advocacy group that has raised a lot of awareness about that condition and really got companies interested in that condition. And many of the other rare syndromes, I suspect, we'll find over time, while they're still rare, there's many more patients out there than we're aware of. And that's as the awareness gets raised for the condition, you start to find more and more people with the condition. But once they identify a population, a strong population that is eager to get treatment and eager to participate, it's much easier to get people, and I'm talking about industry generally, companies that are going to develop the treatments, interested in developing a treatment for that condition. There's only so many epilepsies out there that have been studied. So there's a number of kind of rare epilepsy syndromes that I think have great opportunities. Now we're moving forward to a world of genetic treatments. That becomes a little more difficult, right? Because there's a lot of time and money behind developing any treatment. So they'll want to make sure there's a big enough population in need to I guess to balance out the cost it's going to be to have to develop the trial and the treatment. But really, the biggest thing people can do is make their voice heard. Good advocacy group, raising awareness for their condition, letting people know what the condition is like. That's how you get people interested in treating it.
Do patients entering clinical trials have to come off of their current medication? If not, is it safe to take with the medications that they're already on?
Okay, great. Yeah, great question. So the first answer, do they have to come off of the medicines they're on? Now, typically, the answer to that is going to be no. In fact, we don't change any of the meds they're on because we want to know like how they are in their baseline state. Now, the caveat to that is if the trial maybe excludes a certain medication and you want to participate. Again, I'll use example of one of the recent trials we did. For example, doesn't allow Felbitol as a drug, and that's often a drug that gets excluded from other trials. But that patient really wants to be in this research trial. Well, in that case, I'll try to get them off Felbitol and get them off of that medicine long enough in advance of the trial so that they could participate. So in general, no, you don't have to come off medicines, but there may be some excluded medicines that sometimes we have to take off.
Dr. Perry, I know you referenced this in your presentation, but I think it's important to restate where people can get more information if they're interested in learning about clinical trial participation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you're thinking about participating in research, and I would say this, I feel like everyone should think all the time about participating in research. I mean, one of the reasons we have made so much success in the treatment of childhood cancer is that basically that system is set up that every child is part of research to try to figure out how to cure cancer. And honestly, everyone who has epilepsy should seek to participate in research that helps figure out how to cure epilepsy. And one of the ways you can do it, as I said, is to look at clinicaltrials.gov. That's the site that's going to give you trials that are out, available, or about to start recruiting for your specific condition. That's not the only type of research that's out there, though. I mean, there are registries out there, there are natural histories that are out there, there are different small studies from advocacy groups that are out there. There's lots of way data is being collected. Again, the advocacy group is a wonderful place to look. So if your condition has an advocacy group, then you should be in close contact with them, watching their websites, because they are going to know about what's going on in that space. What is the research that you could get involved in? But like I said, if I had one line and one thing for you to remember, I honestly feel like everyone should aim to be involved in research in some way, because the more data we have, the faster and closer we'll get at finding cures for these epilepsies.
Thank you, Dr. Perry, for your expertise and thoughtful presentation. Now, as I mentioned, we'll hear from Hillary Savoie, the founder of the Cute Syndrome Foundation. She's also a writer, a rare disease advocate, and a mother to a determined little girl named Esme. Welcome, Hillary.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you so much for this opportunity to be here today to talk with you in honor of Purple Day.
Dr. Perry referenced the importance and difficulty developing clinical trials for rare disease populations. Could you tell us a bit more about the efforts to get clinical trials for children diagnosed with a rare genetic mutation like Esme?
Yeah, absolutely. Always happy to have the opportunity to talk about my daughter and the communities that I work within. My daughter, Esme, is actually a very unusual case. She is one of a kind. She has mutations in PCDH19, SCN8A, TBL1XR1, and MAP3K7. And this essentially adds up to her being sort of functionally undiagnosed and an N of 1. So she actually would not qualify for any existing clinical trial in any one of those groups. And I think that although Esme is a very unusual case, I think there are more Esmes out there than we realize, children who have very complex genetic backgrounds that may have multiple contributing factors that might explain why they might respond to treatment in different ways. the communities that I work within, specifically wearing my hat on the Rare Epilepsy Network Coordinating Committee, as well as the founder and director of the Cute Syndrome Foundation, I represent the rare epilepsies, as well as a particular rare epilepsy known as SCN8A. And that is a population of about 450 diagnosed worldwide. So as you might imagine, looking toward developing a clinical trial for a community that's that size, let alone a child who's an individual that's essentially an N of one, is incredibly complicated. How do you get enough community involvement to have a scientifically meaningful number of individuals involved in a clinical trial? And also, how do you make sure that those individuals represent what are typically in these really, really small communities, incredibly diverse populations, very heterogeneous populations who present very differently, often within one single disease.
So, Hillary, what are the challenges when setting up a trial for rare epilepsies?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are so many challenges to getting clinical trials to these communities because, as I mentioned, these are communities that are often very, very diverse and can cause a lot of challenges to designing a trial. And because they're very small communities, we need to get as many children and adults in trials for rare disease populations as possible. So you can't afford to leave anybody behind because the population is so small. And so often this looks like, companies who are developing drugs in these communities needing to get to know them really well. And this is something I find myself saying a lot these days, which is, the traditional route of a company developing a drug for a large population, whereby they go through a third party that will help them understand the community. It just doesn't work in these populations. They need to go directly to the communities to learn from the communities in a hands-on way, because they can't afford to mess it up. And this also means looking at clinical trials from a perspective not so much of bringing families to the trials, but bringing the trials to the families and making them as convenient as humanly possible.
Can you tell us a little more about the importance of educating and engaging the patient and caregiver population when setting up clinical trials? How is this new approach to clinical trial design important to the epilepsy community?
Yeah, so I think this is another really wonderful question. I see my role as an advocate in the SCN8A space as essentially providing as much education and awareness within the family population as humanly possible in order to help them be informed decision makers about their participation in any kind of research, whether it's clinical trials or otherwise. And I think that this is, again, it's very essential because we're asking a lot of these families. Being involved in a clinical trial is a heavy, heavy lift, and these are families that are already facing distinct and significant challenges on a day-to-day basis. And so it's very important that they understand not only the challenges that they might face, but also the value that they're adding. And I think, again, there is a bit of a sense in the past when you were looking at developing a drug for a population of, let's say, 100,000, that, like, if you don't get this guy, you're going to get the next one. And it's fine. But really, in these populations, every single person's involvement counts. It means something. And that isn't just, and I tell our families this all the time, that isn't just showing up for the trial should you meet the criteria and want to participate, but it's before that. It's engaging, it's showing that we are an engaged community that shows up, that will take seriously the educational efforts that are happening, that have good questions, that have good feedback that will help them design better clinical trials so that we get it right the first time, and we get these drugs to our families as soon as humanly possible and as safely and effectively as humanly possible. So it's not just about showing up for the trial. It starts before that. It starts with awareness raising. It starts with showing engagement. It starts with educating themselves about if there are going to be multiple trials in the space, what is the difference between drugs that might be in the pipeline. And this is something we've taken very, very seriously at the Acute Syndrome Foundation, really from day one when we started doing our, we do an annual gathering that's clinicians, researchers, industry, and families. And it was a little bit of an audacious idea in the beginning to put the families in for conversations that were happening between clinicians and researchers. And lo and behold, at our first meeting, some industry showed up, which was very exciting. But it's I always say to the families that their participation and their, they have to be there. They have to be there for those conversations, and they have to ask their questions, because this is a lift that takes an entire community, and everyone has to be bringing what they bring to the table, and the families bring a lot to the table, and industry every single day, I think, is moving toward understanding how much these families bring to the table, how much they can help support in clinical trial design. And likewise, we all have a responsibility to be sure that we understand what's being asked of us and what we're consenting to. And so for me, that's a huge focus and such an important piece of really, sort of bringing that entire network that participates in clinical trials closer together, rather than building barriers between the communication amongst all of those players. I love that our families have literally met the scientists who have built the molecules that will be in clinical trials for our community. They know their names.
Thank you, Hillary, for sharing your thoughts on this important topic. And thank you once again to Dr. Scott Perry. The drug development process and participating in clinical trials are critical to helping us find treatments and cures for epilepsy. If you'd like to learn more, please visit our website, cureepilepsy.org, where we have several podcasts on clinical trials and patient participation. Thank you so much.